Just when we thought job growth and economic recovery were becoming the norm, along came federal budget cuts.
We certainly have to account for what the sequestration cuts are, and especially with the defense industry in Arizona playing a predominant role here.
Yet some say things aren't as bad for us in Arizona as they are elsewhere.
We're a fast-growing state, and so the sequestration is only going to cut a percentage off of our rate of growth. We're still going to be growing, and significantly compared to a lot of other states.
State legislators get an update from their finance and economic advisors, and we listen in. It's Arizona Week.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chiha.
Arizona job growth and overall economic sluggishness remain worrisome to state leaders, but they heard notes of cautious optimism from a panel of economic and financial experts this week at the spring meeting of the Joint Legislative Budget Committee's Finance Advisory Committee. Panel members said state tax revenue growth is nearly 4% ahead of last year through March, and job growth this year could be 2%. After their presentations, we sat down with two of those economic experts, Aruna Murthy of the State Office of Employment and Population Statistics and Jim Rounds of Elliott D. Pollock and Company, to get their analysis. Mr. Rounds, your forecast for Arizona's economy calls for slow growth in 2013, a little faster in 2014, perhaps back to normal in 2015. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think our optimism has been tempered just a little bit, and a lot of that had to do with the uncertainty in Washington over the last several months, causing some businesses to want to hold off on investment, consumers to pull back a little bit on spending. But the businesses are starting to invest a little bit more. You're going to see more of that happening in the summer and the fall. So you're going to see some of that activity occurring, but it didn't occur as early as we anticipated. So we were anticipating that we were going to see growth, let's say in terms of employment for Greater Phoenix as one example, of around 3%. Well, we brought that down to about 2.5% for our forecast because of the sequestration issues. There's a lot of numbers out there on sequestration, so you really have to pick and choose which studies are right. But that issue, some of the uncertainty in terms of how the federal government's going to be operating and where the different cuts are going to occur, there are very few items that are going to be the big ticket items that are going to impact the forecasts and budgeting. So we don't have to cover the 50 or 60 data points that we would normally and then aggregate them. I think most of the discussion is going to be dominated by very few.
And Dr. Murthy, the effects on the job market in Arizona, a little slower job growth perhaps?
We'll be putting out a forecast sometime in early May, but we certainly have to account for what the sequestration cuts are, and especially with the defense industry in Arizona playing a predominant role here.
So you expect to see growing job market in Arizona, but perhaps with some caveats because of sequestration and other factors.
Yeah, we have two important factors playing a role here. We had a 2% payroll tax increase, so that certainly affects a consumer's disposable income on various things that they can spend on. Again, we also had sequestration cuts. So when there is a disposable income issue, especially under conditions of high unemployment, that further inhibits people from spending more, thereby when there is no circulation of money in the economy, that causes more issues with regards to number of jobs being created. So what I see is there'll be a slower rate of growth in terms of jobs, but certainly we will see job growth. Maybe not at rates that we had planned before, like Jim mentioned. We have to include the fact that there are going to be significant cuts from sequestration, and how that translates into job growth.
And Arizona's in a unique position on this because we're a fast-growing state. And so the sequestration is only going to cut a percentage off of our rate of growth. We're still going to be growing, and significantly compared to a lot of other states, but we are very dependent on aerospace and defense. I'm not worried about Greater Phoenix at all. I'm worried about maybe the Yuma area, Sierra Vista. I'm worried about some of the impacts at Davis-Monthan. So some specific regions, I think, are going to be impacted more dramatically. But when you roll all this up into the state level, what it turns out to be is if the state was forecasting a baseline of 5 or 6% in terms of revenues, the math comes out that you want to shave about 1% off of that. So instead of forecasting 5%, you come down to 4. If you instead of forecasting 6%, you come down to 5. But the forecast that's being utilized right now includes considering some of that, but there's so many unknowns. That's why I think the legislature has to be pretty conservative, at least for the upcoming budget.
And Mr. Rounds, your forecast about jobs affected by sequestration is a loss of approximately 30,000 spread over 2 years. That's a fairly small loss in the grander scheme of things, is it not?
It's a small loss in the grander scheme of things. It's helpful when we're already growing, but there's been a variety of estimates. I've seen one estimate as low as somewhere between 10 and 15,000, and I've seen one as high as 50,000. But the one that went a little bit viral, the one that said we're going to lose 50,000, was just updated because of a lot of the factors that we were talking about before, and their number came down to around 36,000 for the coming year. So it's getting closer to a number that's still significant, but it all gets back to how you benchmark things. If somebody came out and said there's no losses, and then we came out and said there's going to be 30,000, people would fall over and have a heart attack. Now, the starting point was around 50,000. So then we come out and say 30,000, and they're saying, well, that's optimistic. It's 30,000 jobs. And even spread over 2 years, it's a lot, but it's going to be problematic. It's not going to debilitate our economy, but it's going to be very problematic. And the specific regions, we're going to have to do something in terms of economic development there.
And Dr. Murthy, the regions that Mr. Rounds makes reference to, rural areas, always see higher unemployment rates in Arizona than the cities. Is that not correct?
That's right. I totally agree with what Jim said. There are going to be regional impacts felt at a stronger rate than what the state feels overall, because a lot of the regions he mentioned, defense industry might be the only, if there is an army base and the entire economy is based out of that army base, they are dependent on that livelihood and on that industry for their livelihood. And if that goes away, then they don't have, anything to fall back on. So the regionally, unless they think about alternative scenarios or what might be brought in there to help these people who either are impacted directly or indirectly through these job cuts, will have to be thought about.
Mr. Rounds, let's turn to one of the biggest factors in the Arizona economy, and that is housing. Your forecasts there are for slow growth again there, although there is some acceleration, and we're seeing some pricing movement there. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Right. So for some perspective, in the greater Phoenix area, we saw a 30% increase in values in the last year. We can't have that increase again in the coming year. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we could have a bit of a bubble, or we're going to go back into one of those trends that goes up and down. And I think we need more certainty in the economy. I'd rather see slower movement. So our forecast, based on the economic factors that would go into it, is calling for still healthy growth, 10 to 12%. That's still pretty good. But some people might be disappointed that they're not going to see another 30% increase. But just the fact that home prices are going up is causing some additional confidence in individuals. That issue, and also issues in the stock market, people's retirement, just their financial portfolios, some of those have been temporarily resolved. Now, the stock market might be a little bit inflated right now, but it's a whole lot better than it was not that long ago. In the Tucson area, we saw about a 15% increase in prices. Now, the equivalent would be if we saw another 15%, we could be at risk again. So we're seeing increases in home prices, some additional development. It's growing at a strong rate, but it's because we're growing off of a fairly weak base. The Tucson region and greater Phoenix are going to get back to normal housing production about 2015.
And Dr. Murthy, tied closely to that, obviously, is the construction sector in the job market. What are you seeing there? Does it match what Mr. Rounds is talking about in terms of how the sector is growing?
Yes, our construction numbers at the beginning of this year were revised, and actually they were revised down from what the last year's numbers were. But even with that revision, we are seeing decent growth. Again, the base is very small, like Jim mentioned. The last month's numbers were 7.7% over the year growth for the construction employment. Again, this has a lot to do with when people start moving here. I have a strong hunch that it will be driven more by population. As people move here for whatever reason, either they are able to sell houses in other areas and move here, or move here for jobs or to retire, that's the time where you'll see really construction take off. Because even now, where there's a shortage of single family homes around Arizona, the prices are going up because there's limited supply. At some point that will run out. They will have to build more if people come. And in a lot of different areas are seeing growths, like the Chandler area, we are finding a lot of construction activity taking place with the Banner Desert Center coming up. There is the Chandler Regional Hospital is expanding. It's it has about I think it's creating close to 100 rooms or something, new rooms, and so there's an entire building coming up. We are seeing construction jobs across the state, but not at levels that we used to see before. Again, if you look at the average permits, number of new permits issued, it's not big. I mean, it's they are issuing permits to build new construction at a nominal amount, and I think various factors, essentially jobs would play an important role in people relocating here and settling in Arizona, and that'll have an impact on construction.
And we'll get a lot of those jobs back, a lot of the ones that are related to growth. So I have a feeling eventually, and it'll probably be around 2015 again, the construction employment's going to come back, retail. The ones that are going to be more difficult are the higher value added jobs, and that's why I think economic development comes into play. And one of the best things that the state's doing that's going to be helping some of these challenged areas related to the military operations is the unmanned aircraft systems application. If we can get that designated space, we're working with the Commerce Authority, and they have a huge team of very, very intelligent people putting together the application. If we can be one of the designated regions for the airspace, and we're working with them to put together the employment projections, we have a new industry that's going to disproportionately develop here. So we need that, plus we need a number of other efforts that focus not just on the state as a whole and how Greater Phoenix alone can benefit, but also Tucson, Sierra Vista, Yuma, and others. But I feel like the state's paying attention to this. 3 or 4 years ago, I would have no hope. Right now, I'm pretty optimistic that we're going in the right direction.
Now, Dr. Murthy mentioned, Mr. Rounds, that population growth is going to help drive jobs, at least in the construction industry, because it'll increase the demand for housing. What are you seeing in your forecast for population growth?
Population growth right now is probably closer to 1%. It's going to inch up to a couple of percent after a couple more years, so it's going to slowly increase. But some of that's going to be dependent on the extent that we can capture a lot of these individuals that would have liked to have moved to Arizona and located in our fine communities, but couldn't because they were tied to their homes, because they were upside down in their mortgages. They couldn't move because their retirement portfolios were just a mess. They're in better shape now, and so now they're going to have the ability to move here, and I'm hoping we can capture those. Not just the retirees, but a lot of the baby boomers that might want to move to the different communities in Arizona and maybe get into that entrepreneurial spirit, maybe start up a small business, and that's going to help drive our economy. But then you have specific economic development efforts related to that and the marketing of the state. So this is another example, like the UAS, the unmanned aircraft. That's one program, trying to maximize our ability to get the types of individuals like the retirees, the second homeowners, the people that are going to be the baby boomers starting up the new business. If we have specific programs that target this, we might not be able to replace every lost job that we had overnight, but we're giving ourselves the best option to do that as quickly as possible, and then not just add jobs, but add quality. I don't care if we just add a bunch of McDonald's jobs. I want to add jobs at some of the higher value added places too.
Dr. Murthy, all of those people getting good jobs, they go out and spend money. At the economic forecast meeting this week, you mentioned some concern about what's going on in the retail sector as far as employment goes. It's a little softer than what you would hope to see, especially considering what retail sales growth is like.
Yes, I mean, if you look at the end of 2011 onwards, for some reason I'm finding that the employment in the retail sector is going down. It could be with online taking a greater presence than retail outlets, especially with the younger generation, people who go shop online. That may be playing a role there. And I think an economy overall is still, I think, a big factor, because people are, end of last year, all the discussion was, what is Congress going to do? What is the sequestration effect going to be? So people think of all those factors directly or indirectly in their decision to spend or not spend. So I think in some capacity, companies are making those decisions, who to hire and how much, based on what the retail sale volume is going to be. And there is a concern in a downward trend. I mean, a few more months would tell me, what exactly is going on in that particular sector. At this point, it's hard to actually pinpoint a reason, but we are finding wholesale trade go up. So maybe some of it is being compensated by wholesale trade. There are a lot of fulfilling centers being opened in Arizona that are catering to the demands around the region. So maybe there is something else, like Amazon is opened up, and a lot of other centers who are shipping throughout the U.S. So maybe those type of jobs will take some of the cuts that are going on in retail.
Mr. Rounds, what are the uncertainties that could change the way you're forecasting now between now and 2015? What could occur that would speed up the recovery or slow it down even more?
Sure. Congress and the President are going to be working on trying to give a little more flexibility related to sequestration so the cuts can occur in a more strategic way. Arizona is well positioned in this new military type of activity, the higher tech stuff, the stuff that you would see at Fort Huachuca, et cetera. We actually have the potential of not seeing as big a cuts locally as what they might have shown when they just doled them out with reckless abandon, it seemed. So that might not hit us to the same extent. We also discussed at the meeting today, the forecast meeting at the legislature, the recent federal employment number slipping from in the 200,000s down to 88,000. It's not exactly clear what caused that, but if that ends up being a little bit more of an anomaly, it has to do with maybe a data collection process, and that's not a trend. And we truly are going to get back to the 200,000 jobs a month, which I think is needed for us to start feeling really good about the economy. Then we might become a little bit more optimistic. But it's just a couple or three things that we're not sure about right now, and I think we'll have more clarity on those over the next 3 to 6 months.
And Dr. Murthy, Arizona at the peak of or at the depth of the recession, I should say, 300,000 jobs lost. How many of those have we recovered to this point, and when will we be in full recovery as far as the job market goes?
We have recovered, I think, close to about half or so. I don't have the exact numbers on me, but we are we still have significant recovery to be made on that front. I'm not sure if a lot of the jobs that we lost, predominantly in the construction industry, will necessarily be the industry where we replace all those jobs. Like Jim mentioned, there are a lot of new industries that are being thought about, and in the recent 4 or 5 years, from a policy perspective, they are trying to attract and diversify the state economy and bring jobs that didn't exist here before. So if that were to happen, those would be the new jobs, high-paying jobs that they are trying to attract and bring, which would add to some of the jobs that we lost in the past. We still have ways to go. We are only growing at about 2% right now. So I think depending on all the investments that are being made right now and how they pan out, the outcome of the future will be made there.
Dr. Aruna Murthy, Director of Economic Analysis for the State Office of Employment and Population Statistics, and Jim Rounds, Senior Vice President and Economist at Elliott D. Pollock & Company. Thank you both for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
It was good being here.
Legislative reaction to the economic forecasts ranged from caution to overt optimism. We spoke with 3 legislators. What's your reaction to what you heard from the Finance Advisory Committee about the economy of Arizona?
Well, my reaction, it was what I expected, to be slow and steady and have moderate gains in the next year to be forecast. This is something I think at the beginning of the year that they did forecast as well. So some minor changes, but overall a slow and steady pace for our economy.
By the nature of the people presenting, JLBC and the others, I think they probably were holding back a little bit, in my view. If anything, I would say that I'm far more optimistic than they are. For instance, I didn't hear anyone comment on the fact that our current state budget and the one before it are balanced. And that over the last 4 years, we've reduced the general fund budget by about $3 billion from 11.6 to 8.6. And as a result, we went from the bottom 10 states to the top 10 in 3 critical categories. One, we're number 1 for business startups. If someone wants to start a business, we're considered to be the number 1 state to do it. Second, we went from 46 to 4th in overall job creation, and we are number 10 in overall business climate.
The state of the Arizona economy is fragile right now. I'd say that there's 2 main factors. We are recovering from the Great Recession, seems to put it mildly, but we're recovering because I think we made some very important decisions to cut back on spending. Very difficult decisions, but important. They put us on some strong financial ground, but there's still a lot of uncertainty, especially with the healthcare expansion and necessary expenses in education that we're required to pay. I'd say on one hand you have a fragile budget, and on the other hand you have a recovery, nowhere more seen than in my district in Chandler, with Intel and Infusionsoft and GM announcing thousands and thousands of new jobs, engineering, high-paying jobs. And so we have a chance, but we just have to make sure we see this thing through.
The legislature in the last couple of years has approved a number of incentives to grow business, to grow jobs in Arizona. The full impact of those won't be felt for a few years because the tax credits, first of all, don't even go into effect until next fiscal year starting in July. But are you seeing impact from that already?
We are. And the way that large companies make decisions is based on boardroom meetings where they forecast 10-year models. And so clearly if there's something that's coming down the road, they still factor that into their decisions. And we've seen that with a number of companies, especially in my district in Chandler. But I think as we get closer to those incentives, we'll see even increased economic growth.
Our frustration, I would say, is, time and time again, the state legislature has enacted tax cuts, and those tax cuts are in the millions of dollars. For example, in 2016, those tax cuts will be somewhere around $367 million. And during that time figure, we'll have a deficit of about $120 million. So that correlation in itself, it's basically lining the pockets of corporations without attending to the needs and programs of what our constituents need and want. So it is a big frustration because what we hear here at the Capitol is that we don't have money for these programs. Well, we do have money for these programs if we stop giving away that money to tax corporations.
What the Republicans say about that is that's stimulating the economy and growing jobs in Arizona. Do you see that happening?
Well, I've yet to see a study that is able to prove that, to prove that that money goes into creating jobs and stimulating the economy. I would love to see a study that would prove that.
Are other incentives needed in Arizona to stimulate business?
Are other incentives needed? Well, I certainly favor other incentives. In my opinion, I think that there's a lot more that can be done. But it's really looking at a 20-year model. Here's my biggest concern. We grow, especially in the Valley, I think it's some 10 to 15,000 people a month move out here. And I believe that number is going to increase. Flagstaff, Phoenix, Tucson are all merging into something like we see in Southern California, Northern California. It's turning into a megatropolis. And the fate of this megatropolis is headed in one of 2 directions: to become like something where you see in Atlanta, they're a hub. We have the potential to be a hub in the Southwest, even the capital of the Southwest. Or if we make the wrong choices, we could end up becoming like Detroit and become a giant welfare state. And so I think it's very important that we're looking at infrastructure, economic development, and that model, looking down the road 20 years. I still think there's a number of incentives that can be strategically put into place.
Is Arizona taking care of the infrastructure to make that a positive outcome rather than a negative, as you suggest?
I'd say that for infrastructure, we probably get a D-. There's an awful lot that needs to be done, and the real challenge is how you finance it. And in the legislature, that is an area of real concern and argument.
What kind of a role should the state government play in economic development?
I think we should be very proactive in going out there and reaching out. And you know, there's many different states right now that are looking to move. And I think we should make sure that we're presenting ourselves in a manner that is attractive to different companies. And that's by, you know, having a strong economy and having a strong school system as well, I think is something that'll help generate those people to come and move to Arizona.
Do you think the level of taxes that corporations have to pay in Arizona is a factor in businesses deciding to move to the state?
Oh, it definitely is a factor itself, as far as also providing some types of credits as well. But I think those have to be looked at it as a one-by-one basis as well, to see if that credit is truly needed, and is that going to be held accountable by making sure those jobs are here in Arizona and those people are from Arizona receiving those jobs.
What would you say to the average taxpayer about what he or she should know that's going on in regard to how the budget is being managed from your perspective?
Well, and thank you for that question. Every time I have an opportunity to speak to people, I don't ask for a show of hands, but I pose the proposition, how many family budgets are represented here today? And when this program airs on your channel later today, there will be hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of family budgets being represented by the viewers watching the show. So people know how difficult it is, that you don't spend more than you make, and it's an ongoing challenge, and it's true for the state. The point I'm trying to make is that when you do balance your budget, good things happen. And I mentioned going from the bottom 10 to the top 10 of the 50 states in 3 critical areas. I'm just very optimistic.
That's our program for Friday, April 12, 2013. A correction on last week's program. In an interview with State Senator John McComish, I misidentified where he lives. He's from Ahwatukee. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Chihak.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.